the prices are probably it is decoupled with reality, really,
Yeah.
and is reaching record highs. So the average price in London exceeds 500,000 across all boroughs, and this is partly due to the stamp duty being frozen in order to kind of keep that sector going because
Yeah. It's the only
real
one we
estate,
have.
yeah, real estate is big, big business in this country.
It's the only thing the UK has left.
And it just makes you think how, in this unprecedented time of economic hardship, and all, how can we be reaching new heights
How?
in prices? It makes absolutely no sense. And yeah, it was up 9.7%. That's insane. That's insane. That's insane. And then also, who can bleed and afford these? 500,000. You know, a one bed is 300,000 minimum in London, really, unless you're in quite outside pockets of certain boroughs.
A long way away.
How can your average person? How can your average worker? What is the average wage? 24 grand, 25 grand,
26, I think, is the median wage. Like how?
Median wage, and so you need to get a deposit of 50 grand just to get your 10% deposit, and that's without the repayments, which would be you'd have to rent out rooms in your house just to cover the mortgage repayments, because on 26 grand a month, 26 grand a year, you cannot pay, repayments of probably north of 1,800 a month. You'd have to. This just makes no sense to me.
Well, it's crazy. You look at it and you say, a mortgage for a £500,000 house, you're paying upwards of £2,000 a month. It's absurd. The average. It's not 500,000. It's 514. That's insane. It is completely decoupled from reality. Who's living in London? Who can afford to live in London? The answer is nobody. Nobody can afford to live in London, especially when you consider the following. The population of London has dropped for the first time in 30 years. The population of London lost 300,000 people this year. 300,000 people. Anton, you live in Glasgow. If 300,000 people left Glasgow, there'd be no fucker there.
Yeah.
It'd be a ghost town.
Yeah.
Because London's so big, 300,000, you go, all right, well, fair enough. But 300,000 it's a small city has left.
Yeah.
London.
I think 300,000 is pretty much the exact population of Newcastle.
Yeah.
So imagine that population just disappears, and even in London, it's not an insignificant number of people, because 300,000 is about, I think, about the same size as the borough we grew up in, Lewisham.
It's 300,000.
That's still a borough's worth of people that has disappeared. And it just makes you think. Then, how are these prices going up and up and up?
Yeah, who's buying this? Who's buying this?
What investors are going for this? And I think it demonstrates that during these unprecedented times, working people are finding it even harder and harder to get on the property ladder. It was already insane in London, but it's getting increasingly difficult at a time when people are suffering more.
You look at this and it makes no sense. Essentially, and this was happening before Anton and I left. London was in areas you had these blocks and blocks of new flats, just empty. Because guess what? They were all owned by people from Saudi Arabia and Hong Kong, and they were just Singapore. They were just investments. They weren't even renting them out, because the property market is so nuts. They just buy these properties, keep them empty. They'd increase in price by 20%. They'd sell them on to someone else who wanted to invest in property further down the line. And you can't afford houses in London because you're bidding against people abroad who are viewing it as an investment, not somewhere to live. And people are giving up now. People are leaving. So all you're going to have, good on them, yeah, exactly. All you're going to have in the end is people servicing a very select elite. But those people servicing the very select elite will have to live further and further out of London if this continues, because no one can afford to buy or rent in London, and it's just going to be a ghost town.
And I think certain parts of West London and nice neighbours already kind of are ghost towns. I have a vague memory of there being a scandal when the Haygate estate at Elephant and Castle got demolished and redeveloped, and you guys will all be able to be rehoused in the same area. And then you've got people who got moved out to like Newcastle, Dumfries and Galloway here in Scotland.
it's just a license to print money. And you're right about the estate at Elephant and Castle. Essentially, for people who don't know, Elephant and Castle housing estate was social housing.
Yeah, the Haygate estate.
The Haygate estate was social housing, so people were living there, and it was affordable. You paid rent to the state. That was fine. Then you had the option to start buying your own property if you wanted, but then there were also people who said, no, I'll just keep renting my property off the state. Perfect, no problem, because it's capped rent, like in Berlin or something like that. It's capped, it's affordable. You can live in the centre of London. Elephant and Castle is super central.
Yeah.
You could afford to live there. It was great. You could work in London.
15-minute walk from London Bridge, where the Shard is, if
exactly.
you go from
It was great. So then what happened is property developers came in and said, well, that housing estate's a bit shit. We'll make it nice and new. We'll add a few houses to sell off to make our money, but basically everyone can have the option to repurchase their new house, and we'll let them move back in. So we'll pay them for the existing house they're living in, or if they're renting, they'll get the opportunity to rent it again when it's been rebuilt in the new version. Perfect. So what happened is they moved everyone out, they knocked them all down, they built all this spanking brand new stuff. Like Anton said already, some of it wasn't then even advertised in the UK, but for the people who existingly lived on the estate, say their property, the development company gave them 200,000 or 300,000 to move out of that property, to sell that property so that they could redevelop it. Well, when they turned up to say, oh, I'd like to buy that house back, they went, oh, well, it's worth 500 now.
Yeah.
And these people are sitting there going, well, you gave me 300. How it's my house? How much? I can't buy my own house anymore. And the same thing was happening with the renters. So the renters got moved out and said, yep, you'll have the opportunity to rent your house back. And they were promised broadly equal rent. So they would say, let's just put a number ahead. They were paying 500 a month. Well, when they said, oh, it's built now, I'd like to rent it back, they said, it's £1.5 grand now.
Sucks.
And this is the thing. So people were rehoused, like Anton said. You're from southeast London, and suddenly you're rehoused in Dumfries and Galloway because that's the nearest available social housing. Families were ripped apart, communities were ripped apart, all because of private profit. And even the people who owned their homes, who sold those homes in the understanding that they would be able to buy them back once the new homes were built, they were pushed out of their own house because they could no longer afford to buy back their own house. It's sickening. And then the majority of those houses weren't even sold to people who were actually going to live within them. They were sold as investment opportunities to either rich people in the UK or wealthy people abroad. And that is a microcosm of the housing bubble and the housing problem in London. And that is why I wouldn't be surprised if more people leave London. Disclaimer, Anton and I left London. We're now property owners. We both own houses in Scotland because guess what? Property is affordable in Scotland because it's not this. We were able to leave London where we knew we were never going to be able to afford property ever in our lives.
Or living in our parents' front room for the rest of our lives.
Exactly. Or living with our parents forever. And we will be able to come to Scotland. We'd been living with our parents in London, so we'd been able to save a bit, which was great. We were very lucky to be able to do that. But we were then able to come to Scotland, where there is also incentives for young people to buy property. The government will actually assist you in doing that. Can you imagine such a thing in England? In Scotland, the government will help you buy property. So we moved to Scotland, lived in Scotland, and Scotland gave us the opportunity, with the money we've saved, to purchase our own houses in Scotland. Meanwhile, this is happening in London. And I think the exodus is just going to keep going and going and going, because if you live in London and you're an average person, you look at this and you say, hold on a second. So the average house price, that's just average, is over 500,000. How do I achieve that? If you're our age, if you're in our 20s, 30s, 40s, how do you achieve that unless you're absolutely minting it? And the majority of people aren't. They're not, because the median wage in the UK, I think, is between 26 and 28 grand. That's not going to cut it. That is not going to cut it here.